Good afternoon, everyone. It's quite an honor to stand here and introduce Sister Mary McCormick, a friend from 50 years ago. She is the Superior General of the Ursuline Sisters and also a professor of systematic theology at St. Mary's Seminary. Sister is one smart cookie. Let me tell you. She has countless degrees from Youngstown State, Duquesne, from New Orleans, from Fordham in New York. But I'm not going to talk about all of those accomplishments. I decided to do some investigations on my own and find out some things about Sister to share with you today. As I said, she's one smart cookie, but she loves scones. So we'll say that she is one smart scone. She's a sports fan, not one team, but multiple teams. Of course, Notre Dame, being the wonderful Irish woman that she is, the Ohio State Buckeyes, Cleveland Browns, and yes, her alma mater, Ursuline High School, a graduate in 1973. Sister was a step dancer when she was young, as many of our Irish children can tell you that, and perhaps with a little coaxing, she'll do a little jig for us at the end. Sister has lived on Elm Street for over 20 years, and her dear friend, Sister Nancy Dawson, would sit on the porch while Sister would grade her papers, oftentimes drinking her freshly brewed tea and eating a scone, or sometimes enjoying her favorite Handel's ice cream. But they liked to watch the action in Wick Park mostly. Sister has a humongous family, and since 1968, they've been traveling to Lake Erie. I don't know how many, probably, Sister, how many would you say? Hundreds. Their family is quite humongous, as I said, and they practically rented all the cottages on Lake Erie. Unfortunately, those cottages have been torn down, and they didn't even contact Sister about that, and they had to just go part of the family for a weekend, and Sister enjoyed that recently. She loves chatting with children, students, and just about everyone. She's a true Irish woman, a friend, a sister, a remarkable woman. And now it's time for Sister to chat with us. We're honored to welcome you, Sister, today to share the blessings of our Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown, 150 years of service. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That's a really touching way to introduce a speaker, so I appreciate that. But I can tell you, even with a lot of coaxing, I will not do any more Irish dancing. Even though, if any of you have been part of that, even though the woman who taught us Irish dancing a million years ago is still the official teacher of them. I don't know how she does that exactly, because I think she comes in a wheelchair. But nevertheless, she still is the teacher, so just kind of an amazing legacy. I really am honored to be here. I was part of the First Friday Club board in the beginning, and so I think it's just such a tribute to Sister Ann McManaman, who was kind of the brain behind the thing in the beginning, and all of the people who've served on the board for so many years that this continues. It's a wonderful opportunity for people to gather, to share, a sense of community here in the Youngstown area, and to have an opportunity to continue to grow in our faith. And so I commend all of you that are still part of it. Mary Ellen Brannigan, I know, has been part of it from very early days, and many of the rest of you as well. So congratulations for that. We are not the only First Friday Club that meets on Thursday. This very day, the group in Cleveland actually meets at the seminary, and they too meet on Thursday. So I got an email this morning saying, if you still want to come to the luncheon, you're welcome. I said, I'm doing my own First Friday Club this week, so I can't join you for lunch. But I also want to say, because I have spoken to many of those other groups in the Cleveland area, the one we have here in Youngstown, I think, is at least as good, if not better. I wouldn't tell the Clevelanders that because they really think they're the center of the universe, but I really think what we have here is quite good. So thank you for all of those who've been part of it now for a good 20 years. I'm also very honored to speak today about the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown. And Ray Novotny was the person who first suggested this date. And we kind of chose this date together because it is this month, September 18th, that is the actual foundation date of the Ursuline Sisters coming to Youngstown. And so our community will be gathering on that day. It's a Wednesday this year, so we'll be gathering for evening prayer and a dinner just to mark that occasion. So it's really a great opportunity to have all of you celebrate with us, because as I look around the room, there are so many interconnections. It's just a wonderful spirit that we share here. And so I want to talk about a little bit of that history, a little bit about how we got from where we were to where we are, and also a little bit about the future. And the other thing I want to do is leave some time for questions. So we'll do that toward the end as well. All right? Now you're going to get nervous when I say, where did we start? Because I'm going to start with Jesus. And you're saying, uh-oh. I thought we were only going to do 150 years of history. Here we are now doing 2,000 years of history. How are you going to get that done in the next 45 minutes? But it always, for those of us that are Christian, it always begins with Jesus, right? The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus literally changed the world. And from the very beginning, people wanted to follow the life of Jesus and to imitate him in what he said, in what he did, in his communications with people, in drawing people in who maybe felt a little bit on the edges. And so that's what all of us are called to do as baptized Christians. But in the course of history, one of the things that happened is that some people said, I really want to devote my whole life to that. And so we can look at some of the great people throughout the history of the Christian church to say, who are some of those examples of people who have lived in imitation of Jesus? Now, we can name lots of people. I'm just going to lift up a couple because we don't have hours and hours to spend on this. This is kind of an image of maybe what St. Benedict looked like. If in the history of Christianity you were going to say, how do we think about the beginning of religious life, especially in the Western church, most people look to St. Benedict and say, he really started it. That's where monasticism began. In Italy, and the Benedictines, who are still active in the church today, followed the life of Jesus in community, devoting their lives to prayer and to work so that they could live more closely in union with Jesus. And that's kind of how religious life got started. For a long time, all religious life was very monastic. You lived in a monastery, and you spent your whole life in that monastery. One of the things the Benedictines did was to say, we're going to take a vow of stability. Didn't mean that they just, didn't use a cane or anything like that. Stability meant they're going to live in the same place for the rest of their lives. And that was the history of religious life for a long time. But, I'm fast forwarding now several hundred years, and we get to the rise of the mendicant orders. So I don't know if mendicant is something that's in your vocabulary, but you certainly know the followers of those mendicants. The two most famous of the mendicants were St. Dominic and St. Francis. And their insight about being followers of Jesus, like all Christians, like The Benedictines, they wanted to follow Jesus more closely, but they said, not in a monastery. We want to be out and about. We want to be preaching the gospel. And each of them, Francis and Dominic, brought a different gift to that. For St. Francis, it was a focus on poverty, and a joy in all of creation. And so today we rejoice in the gift that Franciscans have been to the church. But in addition to them, there are the Dominicans. And of course, here in Youngstown, we have St. Dominic's Parish, staffed by the Dominican priests. We used to have Dominican sisters here as well, but they no longer serve in our diocese. But the Dominicans were focused on preaching. You study and you pray in order to preach the gospel. And you do it to the ends of the earth. They too were following Jesus. The very end of St. Matthew's gospel says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." The Franciscans and the Dominicans said, we're going to do that, and we're going to do it by being out in the world. And so you have a new phase of religious life. It's not that the Benedictines disappeared. It's just now we have a new form of religious life. Now I'm going to get to the 16th century. You're saying, whoa, that was easy to get from Jesus to the 16th century. In the 16th century, we have people who begin to follow religious life, and they do so in what are called apostolic religious communities. Perhaps the most famous of those who started an apostolic religious community was St. Ignatius of Loyola. If any of you went to a Jesuit institution, if you went to John Carroll, if you went to the University of Loyola in Chicago, Loyola in Los Angeles, Loyola in New Orleans, if any of you were part of the LIMEX program, you studied with the Jesuits and out of that Jesuit tradition. St. Ignatius lived at the time of the Reformation and started this community that on the one hand wanted to follow Jesus. They didn't want to be monastics, so not exactly like Benedictines, but they also were not going to be Franciscans or Dominicans either. It was a sense of they wanted to have a contemplative life, but do so in the world. And of course, one of the things that Ignatius was most known for was trying to educate people. Today, the Jesuits continue to have a very strong academic bent to them. Now, the other reason I think that Jesuits are so well known is because when they write books and essays, they write a lot about themselves. I don't mean that as a criticism, but they find themselves very interesting. And so they keep writing books about themselves and the famous people in their community. And so there's a lot that we know about the Jesuits, even if you say, I don't really know any Jesuits personally, but we know a lot about them. And so we get to that. But that also makes a connection to the communities for women. So far, all of the founders that I've talked about, St. Benedict, St. Dominic, St. Francis, St. Ignatius of Loyola, have been men. It's not uncommon, right, when we do the history of almost anything in the Western world, that the focus tends to be on men. Many times those religious communities would have a group of women that would follow that same type of spirituality. It was true for the Benedictines and still is true. True of the Franciscans and still is true. True of the Dominicans and still is true. The Jesuits never founded a female group. However, and this is one of the things in the 16th century, there were women who then began to say, we can do this ourselves. And one of the women who did that was St. Angela Merici. Angela Merici would have been a contemporary of St. Ignatius of Loyola. She was born in Italy, Brescia, Italy, and very much interested in the life of the church. She did not want to be a monastic. There were monasteries close to where she grew up, and she did not want to be a monastic. She wanted to live among people, in the midst of people. whoops. This, if you know anything about the geography of Italy, and most of us don't know much except it's shaped like a boot, right? So this is not in the boot part. This is more toward the northern part and in the center where that little red dot is. That's where St. Angela would have been from. Because she was there, because it was the 16th century, there were lots of influences for her in her life. Yes, she was very much committed to a life of ministry in the church, very much committed to a life of prayer, very much interested in seeing the reform of the church. Both St. Ignatius of Loyola and St. Angela lived at a time when the church needed a lot of reform. And everybody agreed with that. Even the church said, we need some reform. They didn't always agree about how to do that. But it was that time period in history that we call the Reformation. For both St. Ignatius and St. Angela, it was a sense of, we want to do this in the church. Now I say that because just north of Italy is Germany and Austria and some of the other Germanic countries. And if you know the history of the Reformation, you know that Protestantism took root very much more in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. But because Angela lived so close to the border there, she would have been much more aware of some of the themes that were very important for the Reformation. Themes like, who can read? Today, of course, we take literacy for granted. Everybody should read. But in the early 16th century, one estimate that I read said that approximately 3 to 4% of the population can read. Isn't that something? 3 to 4% of the population. So I'm guessing this is a group of about 100. To say 3 to 4% of the population would to say 3 or 4 of us could read. The rest of us couldn't. Angela said, I think that's a really important theme. And as she gathered women around her, one of the things she did was to say to the women that she gathered around her, if you know how to read, teach the others. Help them to learn this skill. Now for us, that's kind of like, wow, I never even thought of that kind of thing, because we all can read. We all can write. That would have been a brand new skill. And imagine how exciting that would have been. Now, she doesn't exactly say, I want to teach you how to read. What she says when she encourages the women who were around her, when she encourages them, she said, teach them how to pray the Psalms. Teach them how to pray the Psalms. Now, they weren't memorizing them. They were reading them. It was a way of gathering people in prayer. It was a way of teaching them to read. It was a way of connecting them to that larger Christian tradition and say, yes, of course you can do this. That was always a skill that men in monasteries would have learned, that men in mendicant religious communities would have learned. Angela says, I want the women to learn it too. I want them to have part of that. She named her community the Order of St. Ursula. She didn't name it after herself. You know, when you think about the Dominicans and the Franciscans, why are they called that? Well, they're called that because they named it after themselves, right? What did Angela do? She named it after St. Ursula. You know, who was St. Ursula? Well, actually, we don't know much about St. Ursula, but the tradition that we have goes back to about the 3rd or 4th century. Ursula was a woman who wanted to live a life dedicated to God. Her father thought she ought to marry somebody that would be a good political ally, right? These are in the days of arranged marriages. Her father thought she ought to be married to somebody that would be a good political ally. And Ursula said, well, wait a minute. I don't know that I want to do that. But if I am going to do it, only after I've had a chance to gather with some other women and to spend some time in prayer and reflection. And so the story is that when she was with these women, they were then martyred. Now, how many were martyred? Who knows? By the time we get to the 16th century, the story was there might have been 10,000 martyred. We don't know if there was that many. Could have been 10, could have been 100, could have been 1,000. You know what happens if you add a zero here and there, right? All of a sudden you have thousands. So we don't know much, but we do know that by the time we get to St. Angela, there's a very strong devotion to St. Ursula, and in particular that she is the patron of medieval universities. If you ever go to Germany, in the city of Cologne, there's a great basilica there in the memory of St. Ursula, and that whole sense of she would be the patron of medieval universities. And again, you say to yourself, well, universities, they're everywhere. That was a relatively new thing when you get to the time of the Reformation, that there would be universities that would be open to a much broader sense. In the days of monasticism, who would learn? People would learn if you're in the monastery. But if you weren't in the monastery, you didn't learn, right? And there wasn't much sharing about learning. By the time we get to the medieval time, there is more learning, most of it in the beginning directed to men. But again, St. Angela says this learning we want to share with women. We want them to be part of it as well. And so the word feminist didn't even exist in that day, but Angela had a sense that women can help women here. She would have begun what today we call networking, right? There would have been no such word as networking at that time. But Angela would gather with some of the wealthier widows and have them teach younger women. Among the younger women she would gather would be women who had been, for one reason or another, disowned by their families. You say, now why would they have been disowned by their families? During that time of the Reformation, the governmental structure was very much city-states. And in those city-states, there were often these wars. And as soldiers would go through the various city-states, like today, one of the weapons of war was sexual violence. You know, and if a young woman got raped, if she would end up being pregnant, there would be great turmoil. Nobody would then marry her. The family would disown her. And so where would she live? Where would she go? What would she do? Angela often gathered those women, taught them some skills, taught them how to read, and they would, then have a life. Not the life maybe that they thought about when they were 10 or 11 years old, but they would have a life. They would have a purpose. They would have a meaning. They would have friends. They would have a supportive community. So Angela had these wealthy widows, these young women that she gathered. She networked with the church officials at the time. I mean, again, that's the word we would use today. They would have never used that word, but she knew the priests and the bishops of her area. And she would gather with some of the wealthy businessmen. And all of them worked together to try and form a new thing. What Angela did eventually, although in the beginning she said, I don't want to start a monastery. I don't want to do what those other people did. But in fact, she started a brand new form of religious life. In a way, parallel to the Jesuits, there was a sense of deep prayer, of contemplation, but also a deep sense of ministry. Now, sometimes you might say to yourself, oh, the Ursulines were always educators, and you're making that connection right now that, of course, Angela taught them to read. It wasn't really starting Catholic schools yet. That happened. But it wasn't starting schools yet as much as it was, I'm going to gather these people together because they need help. They're poor, they're abandoned. In a sense, they're orphaned. We need to help them. And we're going to gather people to do that, whatever their need is. All right? So all of that happened in Italy, kind of the northern part of Italy. So what's the next thing? Oops. There we go. Eventually, you have the spread of Ursuline life. And the spread of Ursuline life, much like the church itself, if there was... had a foundation there in Italy, it spread north, and then both east and west. You know, if you're in Italy, you've got to go north first, and then you go east and west. So it went to various parts of the Balkan world and Germany, but it also went over to France. Now I'm going to follow that French line because it's the French line that ends up here in northeast Ohio. So you have this movement of women who follow the example of St. Angela, who live Ursuline religious life. It's developed a bit. The other part here that's significant is the Council of Trent. Whenever you hear the word Tridentine, talk maybe about the Tridentine Mass or that part of history. That was in the early 16th century, the middle of the 16th century. And there were lots of things that came out of the Council of Trent, some helpful, some kind of, in the end, ended up being a bit oppressive. But one of the things was religious life. And religious life got such attention because if you say who was the founder of the Reformation, who was the one who started the Reform, you could say it was Martin Luther. And when the church said, all right, what happened? How come all of this happened? They looked at Martin Luther, they said, you know what? He was in religious life. He was an Augustinian monk. You know, something went wrong there. We got to put more rules about religious life because we don't want this to happen again, right? This has been a tragedy. We don't want this to happen again. So we need more rules for religious life. The Ursulines who develop, and all religious life that develops after the Council of Trent is rooted in that sense of now there are going to be more rules. So they get to France, and the bishops in France said, you know what? I think all nuns, no matter what their history is, they all ought to live in a strict monasticism. So there were still Benedictines around in the world, but the French bishops said all nuns have to live in a strict monastic household, which meant they wouldn't go out anymore. Now the Ursulines said to themselves, now what are we going to do, right? Now what are we going to do? Because we're about ministry. We're contemplatives in action. So they scratched their heads and they said, here's what we're going to do. If we can't go out and be among the people, we're going to invite the people in to us. And that was the beginning of convent schools. Happened in France, and the Ursulines then began to take a fourth vow. The fourth vow was for education. And then they kind of said to the bishops, and again, I'm being facetious here, but they kind of said to the bishops, well, you can't make us not do that because we've taken a vow, right? Vows trump everything. You're not in charge of vows, we are. And so we're going to take a fourth vow of education, and we're going to bring the girls right in here. And they're going to be in convent schools, right? So that's what you have in France. From France, they come to the New World. And this is, I think, really interesting for those of us who are Americans. You say, when and where did they come? Well, the first came from France to Quebec. If you've ever heard of Saint Marie of the Incarnation, if you've ever been to Quebec City, if you've gone to the old Ursuline convent there, it was 1639 when they first gathered. And they came because there was a need. Lots of French settlers had come over, and these wealthy French settlers said, I want nuns to teach my girls, right? We're going over to this new world. I don't know what we're going to find over there, right? Have no idea what the new world looks like. Remember, there would have been no photographs, hardly any maps, no sense of what they were getting into. But they said, we want our girls educated, and who better but the Ursulines? So Marie of the Incarnation came over with a few other sisters, and they started convent schools in Quebec. But when they got here, they found other people, right? They found the natives who were already here. And Maria of the Incarnation and the others said, well, if we're going to educate the children of the settlers, we also have a responsibility to educate the children of the natives. And so they started, now again, they're not using these words, but they started neighborhood schools, right? They started village schools. They started schools for the people who live here. The first women religious to come to the New World were the Ursulines in 1639. So if you're still living in 2039, right, we're going to have a big anniversary for that, 400 years of nuns, all right? So put it on your calendar, 2039. When you say how many French would have been in Quebec then, maybe about 350, so not many. But these nuns came with them. What about in what is now the United States? Again, the first women religious to come into what is now the United States were the Ursulines from France who came to New Orleans. At the time, New Orleans was still a French colony. All right, they came in 1727. If you remember your history of the United States, the Louisiana Purchase doesn't go into effect until the early 19th century. And so in the beginning, it's really part of a French colony, but they go to New Orleans. If you've been to New Orleans and you visited the old Ursuline convent, that's where they would have come. That's where they would have had a foundation. There are still Ursulines in New Orleans. There are still Ursulines in Quebec. The Ursulines in New Orleans took great pride in the fact that the Ursulines had never left the city, no matter what happened, until Hurricane Katrina. Remember when Hurricane Katrina came through and the whole city got flooded? They had to be removed from their house. It was very painful for them because they had never, and Ursulines had never left the city of New Orleans from 1727 until Hurricane Katrina. Their house was since restored, they were back in the city. But that's the first time in all of those years that they ever left the city. But again, they started convent schools, began a ministry down there, whatever people needed. And sometimes what they needed was recovery after a hurricane, right? If you've ever been to New Orleans and you've had a hurricane, not been in one, but had one, tall glass, red, you know. The first one doesn't taste very good, but it gets better, the second one, you know. You say there was a lot of trauma that went with that. Now, let me say one other thing. Very often, the Carmelite convent in Baltimore will say that they are the oldest convent in the United States. And in a sense, they're right, because Maryland was part of the original 13 colonies. But as Ursulines, we claim that we are the oldest convent in what is now the United States. So, you know, you can do all kinds of things with statistics. There's that one, in case you ever get into a conversation with somebody about what's the oldest convent, all right? So, what about coming to Ohio then? The first women religious in the state of Ohio actually came to Cincinnati. Again, a French foundation. Came along the Ohio River, settled in Cincinnati, and that was in 1845. Now, at the time, all of Ohio was one great big diocese. The Bishop of Cleveland was Bishop Amadeus Rapp, and he had actually sent for those Ursulines to help him in Cleveland, but the bishop, because Amadeus Rapp wasn't quite yet. In 1845, Cleveland was not yet a diocese. It was going to become one shortly, but it wasn't a diocese. And the Bishop of Cincinnati said to the nuns, well, now that you're here, stay in Cincinnati. And so you had a foundation there. But 5 years later, Ursulines came again. Bishop Rapp went back. By this time, he is the Bishop of Cleveland. He goes back and says, I want nuns to be in Cleveland. And so he sent again to the convent at Boulogne-sur-Mer. So I know this is not a great visual, but where you see that letter A, that's Boulogne-sur-Mer. It's from that coastal city in France that Amadeus Rapp says, I want you to come. I want you to be part of coming to Ohio and to the great city of Cleveland. And so Ursulines came from Boulogne-sur-Mer to Cleveland, and Amadeus Rapp was the first bishop. From Cleveland, then, the Ursulines came to Youngstown. Now, the Cleveland Ursulines actually founded two other groups of communities. They had their own foundation. And after they were there only about 10 years, they founded a group in Toledo. And then about 25 years later, they founded the group here in Youngstown. At the time, all of northern Ohio was part of the Diocese of Cleveland. In a sense, you can say that Ursulines were like Benedictines in that when they went to any new city, they started a new house, a new foundation, right? The French bishops had put them into monasteries, so there was a monastic element to their lives. And so they started a new house. They became a separate group. It wasn't necessarily a fight among the nuns, but they started a new house, even though we were all part of one diocese. When they came to Youngstown in 1874, it was the invitation of the pastor of St. Columba. Now, I don't know if any of you are from St. Columba, so if you went to school there or that was your home parish. Certainly you've been to the cathedral, and you're saying, well, that doesn't look like the cathedral that I know. It doesn't, because the cathedral that we know was rebuilt in the late 1950s. There was a fire in the original cathedral. So this is, I know it's not a great picture, but it's a picture of what the sanctuary at St. Columba Cathedral looked like. And the sisters came there. Now, it wasn't the cathedral then, because we weren't a diocese. What it was a parish church. The pastor of that parish church was a Father Patrick Brown. He already had a school. School was run by lay people. And he had a sister who was a Cleveland Ursuline. And he said, I'd like to have nuns for my school. He wrote to the superior of the Cleveland Ursulines, said, will you send me some nuns? And the superior said, okay, sent Sister Angela Brown, Father Brown's sister, and 5 other sisters, and they came to Youngstown. Now, one other little political note here, church politics, not our current politics, but a little church politics. Among the priests in the Diocese of Cleveland, not everybody got along with the bishop. I know, what a shock, right? But not everybody got along with the bishop. And of course, the bishop then had his favorites too. If he didn't like you that much, he sent you to the boonies, right? And if you are in Cleveland, the center of the universe, where are the boonies? Youngstown, right? So Father Patrick Brown was not a favorite of Bishop Amadeus Rapp, and Father Brown didn't like the bishop very much either. So, you know, the nuns weren't really having a fight, but there was a little bit of politics, right? The Ursuline sister who said, you know, my brother's all the way down in Youngstown. You know, isn't that terrible? How come the bishop is so mean to him? Well, who gets sent to Youngstown then? Angela Brown and a couple other of her friends. So they started here in Youngstown. Again, it wasn't really a fight among the nuns, but there was that little bit of politics that was part of it. But the interesting thing is when they came to Youngstown, they stayed. This became home. And since that time, about 200 women, maybe 225, have lived their lives as Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown. Most of us were born here. Most of us went to schools here in Youngstown. Most of us went to Youngstown State University. You know, now, most of them, when they went to Youngstown State University, they didn't set foot on campus until they graduated, but our degrees were from Youngstown State. This really became home. So I want to talk about our history in kind of 4 phases. First, kind of this growth and expansion. Secondly, the beginnings of change. And what is that like? Third, the development of new ministries. And then fourth, kind of where do we see ourselves going? So first, this growth and expansion. What was true of us as a religious community was pretty much true of the history of the church in Youngstown. So if you, like most of us, you grew up in Youngstown, this has always been your place, then, you know, this has been home for you, and you probably went to, I lost my picture there, but she's going to go back and do something to make it reappear. The picture, oh, that, didn't want that there. That's the one I wanted. It's a picture of Immaculate Conception, right? So maybe some of you went to the Immaculate. But if you didn't go to Immaculate, maybe you went to one of the other schools. And I just listed most of the schools that we taught at. First, St. Columba, and then Immaculate, and then Sacred Heart, St. Cyril's, St. Patrick's, St. Peter and Paul, St. Charles, Holy Family, St. Luke, St. Joe's Austintown. We were in Columbiana County, in Wellsville and East Palestine, a little bit in Stark County, St. Joan of Arc. You know, these are places that we served, and we were close to our families. And not only were we close to our families, we got to know all of the other people, right? And we became close to your families. And it was just all of that that was part of this growth and expansion. All these new parishes kept growing up all over town. Lots of us trace our roots to some of those parishes that were in the city, right? My dad's family was from the Immaculate. My mother's family, originally from St. Columba, and then they moved south of the Market Street Bridge, and then they were from St. Patrick's, right? So, you know, started out close to the city, and then they just kept moving outwards a little bit. That's this growth and expansion. Well, I don't know why this won't move, but the next picture I had was the Rayen Avenue Convent, at the corner of Rayen Avenue and Elm Street. That's where our first convent that we built, there it is. It's not there anymore, but the first convent that we built. When we moved here in 1874, they provided a house for us. The parish kind of fixed it up. But eventually we needed a bigger place, and so we had the Rayen Avenue Convent. And that's what everybody called it. Very good at titles, right? The Rayen Avenue Convent. So some of you may have remembered that. We also had the Wick Avenue Convent. As I said, we were really good at titles. The Wick Avenue Convent had been the old Andrews Estate on Wick Avenue. The community bought that piece of property, and we bought it with the sense of using that house as a convent, but also, you know, a sense of not just working in parish schools. There was a sense of wanting to start an all-girls school, right? So Ursuline High School. I know she's going to fix it again, so you'll see a picture of what we call the old building at Ursuline. If any of you went to Ursuline or taught at Ursuline, you remember the old building? It's still there, right? The old building was built in the early 1930s. It was originally an all-girls school, but it became co-ed also in the 30s. Became co-ed because no men's community ever came to Youngstown to start a boys' school. The bishop, we were still part of the Diocese of Cleveland then, the bishop said, will you take boys in? And what do the nuns say? What do the nuns always say when the bishop asks them something? Yes, right? So you'll become a co-ed school. I was an adult before I realized that most Ursuline schools around the world are all girls. Because my father went to Ursuline. Bishop Malone went to Ursuline. Bishop Hughes went to Ursuline, right? Lots of your fathers and brothers and uncles, yourselves went to Ursuline. So there was that kind of camaraderie about Ursuline High School. And Ursuline now has been in existence since 1905. We don't own it anymore, because in the 1950s, Bishop Malone wanted to say, let's have all the schools be diocesan schools. And so they are. So the school still has our name. The school still, has that heritage, but we don't own it anymore, and we have not since the 1950s. Youngstown became a diocese. Oh, there's the high school, right? You know that. Interestingly enough, what Ursuline still calls the new building was built in the late 50s, right? It's like, really? You still call that the new building? Well, it is new compared to the old building, so we're going to go with it. Youngstown became a separate diocese in 1943, and so it took on then its own life. And we, as a community that was founded here, were the only mother house in the diocese. Originally, we were part of the Diocese of Cleveland, but when the diocese became separate, we too became part of this new diocese. We're the only mother house in the diocese. You know, you can go to anywhere in the diocese and people talk about the mother house, and they mean our mother house, right? That's what they mean. I go to Cleveland, and you talk about the mother house, but you're talking about the mother house of the Ursulines. You're talking about the mother house of the CSJs. You're talking about the mother house of one of 30 different communities. We have our own identity. When you talk about the beginnings of change, talk about that beginning really in the 1950s. I don't know when you think things began to change, but they really began in the 1950s. And they began in the 1950s because there was a movement among religious around the country to get educated. We all presume that the Ursulines and many nuns were really good educators. But most of them in the beginning did not have much of a professional background. And there was a sense of they ought to. And so we started to go to college. This is a picture, you can't see it very clearly, but this is a picture of the first and only day that that group of nuns went to Youngstown State University. It was graduation day. If the picture was out a little bit more, you'd see people in the background in caps and gowns. The nuns all wore their habits, right? Because that's what you wore. So this Sisters Formation Convent took on that movement. Then there was Vatican II in the 1960s. The document about religious life in Vatican II was Perfecte Caritatis. How do we perfect charity? How do we perfect this virtue of love? And it said, all religious communities should renew your lives, should focus on the work of your founder, should update your habits, should think about the way you're doing ministry and living your life. Came right out of the Second Vatican Council, and women and religious took that seriously. We are to live with the signs of the times. So what did that mean? Well, for one thing, for us, it meant that we needed to build a new mother house. The Rayen Avenue Convent had been built at the end of the 19th century. The Wick Avenue Convent had been built in the 19th century. The place we had on Logan Avenue had been built in the early 20th century. And none of those houses were big enough for everybody, so we built a new mother house that was finished in 1963. But it was also a time, because of Vatican II, we wrote new constitutions, we began some new ministries, and we had this new mother house. We began to rediscover the work of St. Angela, and not just what people had remembered, but let's look at who she really was. And that's kind of true with every organization. Now you have better ways to find out who this person really was and what she did. And so they began to, all Ursulines began to work at St. Angela and how she lived her life. One of the things that was most visible was the habit. So this was the habit that our community had. I don't know when it began, probably in the 17th or 18th century, but this is what people wore until the early 1960s. All right? Now, A, it was black wool. B, that thing in the front is called a gimp, and it was very heavily starched. And then you had this big thing on the top and a veil over it. So there were probably about 60 or 70 pieces of clothing that went on that, and you needed a lot underneath because you only had 2 of those black wool things. And obviously they didn't get washed very often. So you needed the other clothes to pick up the sweat and the dirt, because those got washed a lot more often. The first change in the habit came because those gimps were too hard to launder, right? Imagine that. And think about how you sometimes wear your lunch or your dinner on your clothes, right? This is white starch. So the first change of habit came to this, and you see the first thing they got rid of was that big gimp. It had nothing to do with the Second Vatican Council. It had nothing to do with becoming crazy liberals. It had everything to do with the fact that that is way too hard to launder. Now, I'm willing to bet lots of you have made changes in the way you've done laundry in the last 75 years. Call me silly, but I'm guessing you use bounce sheets and you use permapress and all that kind of stuff just because life's easier. We did the same thing. That was the first modification. Didn't last very long. The next modification was to this. People wore black and white, black skirts, black jackets, maybe a black dress, and a headdress, but part of their hair showed. All right, that was the second modification that we had. And then the third modification, isn't that a nice picture of Sister Regina? She's right here. She does not have that red sweater on. I didn't cue her in for that, but very nice picture of her. Let me say one other thing about religious dress. Nobody started by wearing a habit. Nobody started that way. At some point, whatever the other women in culture were wearing, that's what nuns wore too. That's what they did. They wore whatever other people were wearing. And if you say, oh, that couldn't be true, think about Mother Teresa. That's a founder that we all kind of have a memory of. Before she became Mother Teresa of Calcutta, she joined a religious community in Western Europe, and she wanted to be a missionary. When she was a missionary and she went in the 1950s to India, people looked at her askance because in India, they didn't know what nuns were, right? She got absolutely no respect, got nowhere. So she began to wear the dress of the women in India at the time. She began to wear a sari, right? And at first her community said, "What are you doing? This is scandalous. You're not wearing the habit of the community." She said, "I've got to dress like the women. Otherwise, nobody will pay one bit of attention to me." Today, the women who belong to the Missionaries of Charity still wear that. It's an example of the clothing kind of getting stuck. And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad thing, but that's what happened. Nobody started out in a habit. They started out in regular clothes, and then it got stuck somewhere, right? It continues on, but that's why many religious communities shifted to contemporary dress to say, we want to dress like the women of the culture. We want to dress like people do in our own day. So that's why we did that. Among the new signs of the times were new ministries. You know, Catholic schools, on the one hand, were thriving, especially in the 60s and the early 70s, but there were other unmet needs. And so members of our community and members of every religious community began to say, let's think about how we address those unmet needs. So there were parish directors of religious education, a preschool. You know, we had a preschool for many years. And today, you know, you say, where can you find a preschool? Just about every corner in Mahoning County, right? When we started a preschool in Canfield in 1963, the best that we know, there was one other preschool in all of Mahoning County. You know, today you say, oh, they're everywhere, but they weren't when we started it. We also started with pastoral associates, with people in higher education. From there, we started some other new ministries, things like Beatitude House, things like our HIV/AIDS ministry, things like immigrant outreach, because nobody else was doing that. Nobody else was really trying to help poor women and their children to find stable housing. Yes, there were food pantries. Yes, there were some things, but who's kind of saying, how do we solve this problem? HIV/AIDS, for the most part in the beginning, was just so terrifying. But we had sisters saying, well, you know what, these people are really hurting. We need to provide some food. We need to provide some support. We need to pray with them. There were lots of funerals in those early days. And for the most part, nobody went to the funerals but some of our nuns. How do we support people? We have spiritual programs that are part of what we're doing. It's our labyrinth. You're welcome to the labyrinth anytime. So what's the current state of affairs? The current state of affairs are, let me describe them in this way. There are 26 Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown. Our median age is 81. All right, yeah, I know. So a lot still going on, even though the median age is 81. Lots still of activity. There are all kinds of things that have changed, but hasn't everything in life changed? I mean, when you think back to your earlier life, there's part of you that say, yeah, there's a consistency, but there's a part of it you say, I never thought this would be the state of my life, right? I just never thought it would be this way, but here you are. And we all adapt to that change. We are trying to continue to share the gift. Share the gift that came to us in Jesus. Share the gift that came to us in St. Angela Merici. Share the gift that continues to be part of our lives. And we share it not only with each other, that's part of it, we still live community life, but we share it with others, our colleagues in ministry, and we continue to share it with the people in Youngstown. It's very much part of what we're doing. We have associates. Some of our associates are here. And so, I'm very proud, too, that there are some people here. Some of the Ursuline sisters are here with me. So if you would raise your hand or stand up, if you can stand up, the Ursuline sisters that are here. We have some associates who are here with us. If we have some associates that are here, if you would stand up or raise your hands. All right, we have a few, yeah, thank you. We have some of our colleagues in ministry, people who work with us and for us at the Mother House and other parts of our ministry. If you would please stand up and be acknowledged for us. These are people that continue to be part of sharing the gifts that we have. We continue to have a young adult outreach. But that young adult outreach, for the most part, people are not saying, I want to be a nun for the rest of my life, right? I mean, we all know the statistics about religion. Today, when you talk about the new nuns, you know what the new nuns means? When they claim their religious identity, they say, N-O-N-E. I have none. It's one of the big issues of our culture, right? The new nuns are people who say, I have no religious affiliation whatsoever. So it's not surprising, really, that you don't have as many people. So we are restructuring our ministries for Ursuline Sisters Mission. We want to continue to hand on the gift that has been ours. And we do so right here with our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues. And we do so with a sense of hope. God has been faithful to us from the beginning, and we believe that God will continue to be faithful to us. We have these core values: compassion, respect, hospitality, and what was the fourth one? Hope. Those are our core values. We can identify that in everything we've done. We continue to do that. We have legacy ministries like work in parishes. Sister Mary Alice is the parish leader at St. Luke's. Dorothy Day House of Hospitality with the Humility of Mary sisters, several of whom are here. We started that a good number of years ago and continue to be involved there. Ursuline High School, along with Cardinal Mooney. We didn't start Cardinal Mooney, but that's part of our legacy ministry as well. And then, now we're at 150 years. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. I think I've talked over my time, so I don't know that we have time for any questions. But thank you very much. I'll be around for a couple of minutes. If you do have any specific questions, be glad to talk to you. Thank you.
Sister Mary, if we could stay here all afternoon, I would probably stay. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for starting off our new season so well. I appreciate it greatly.
Yeah, thank you.
Give her another hand, people.